With the year coming to a close, it's only right that I take a look back at the films that have been released in 2023. Whilst I certainly didn't get to go and see all the films I wanted to this year, I have seen a fair few, and I didn't know how to initially pick out a group of films to talk about because success of a movie is very subjective, so we have to look at it from an objective point of view. So today I'm going to be discussing the top 10 highest grossing movies in 2023. All the information I got from their rankings comes from BoxOfficeMojo, and I am looking at their global performance, which combines the domestic run in the United States and the international run, which is the rest of the world combined. At time of recording, all the numbers are accurate as of the 29th of December 2023. But before I dive into the top 10 list of the highest grossing films, I want to give a shout out to the film that is actually 52nd on the list of the movies that have grossed the highest across the world this year. And that is Godzilla Minus One. At time of recording, Godzilla Minus One globally has made $78,492,000. Whilst this is likely to change because the film has only just been released in international markets, including the United States only earlier this month, and with a black and white re-release coming to Japan in January, this is likely to shoot up a tiny bit more. I don't in any way think Godzilla Minus One is going to overtake any of the films that are on this top 10 list. I think that would be amazing if it did, but it's just not going to happen. But I only bring this up because one, I actually really enjoyed the film and I encourage you to go and see it if you have the chance to. And two, the film only had a budget of around $15 million. The film's director has said it's much less than that and he wishes he had that much money to make the movie. So a rough estimate, let's say it was $10 million. But the film to make $78 million across the globe is very, very good. And I don't think people appreciate how much of a success this is based on its initial budget. And the fact that the film hasn't had a massive marketing budget and has only really gone round through word of mouth. I haven't seen it advertised on TV at all. I haven't seen it advertised at cinemas at all. I only found out about it for an article and then I sought out the trailer for the film myself. And that got me interested in the film and I bothered to go and see it. And despite $78 million not being a lot of money in terms of the other films on this list, the fact that it's seen as a huge success by Toho and they're already talking about a sequel for the movie, I think is worth talking about. And at this time, I do think the film would be able to cross the $100 million globally, and I think that could achieve that by the end of January. We'll just have to wait and see if it does that. It could easily fall short or not do much better than it is doing now, but I feel like with the Academy Awards seemingly recognising it by putting it on the shortlist for some of its categories, and the fact that it's still got some word of mouth and a re-release in Japan coming out in January, I do feel it could hit the $100 million target. But anyway, let's move on to the top 10 performing box office movies of 2023, starting with number 10. Making $476,071,180 is AntMan and the Wasp: Quantumania. This was Marvel Studios' first movie of 2023, and a sequel, so there was clearly going to be some level of attention to this movie. However, we have seen the Marvel Cinematic Universe go into decline over the last few years. Ever since Avengers Endgame and technically Spider-Man No Way Home, which you could argue is a Sony movie, the films haven't been performing as well as they had hoped. But the thing with these movies is that Marvel are just not putting the effort into them that they should be. I feel they got too arrogant for so long and they feel like they can just pump out this content and people go see it. And it is good that they are re-evaluating how they're going to move forward with their movies. This film has been criticised for having very poor CGI, and the visual effects are just awful. But I do think overall that there are very high expectations of comic book movies in terms of their box office. It feels like there's this narrative around movies have to make $1 billion for it to be worthwhile. Looking this up, the budget of the film is about $200 million, and we can presume that the marketing budget of the film was equal to that, so we can assume it cost around $400 million for its completion. However, it's only made, therefore, $76 million in profit, which is not anywhere near what Marvel would want to be making on these movies, and they may consider this a absolute flop. But the fact that the 10th highest grossing movie in the year didn't even pass the $500 million mark, and with so many films out recently, these comic book movies aren't doing that well. We just have to look at the Marvels, which didn't even make the top 10, The Flash didn't make the top 10, and Aquaman isn't going to make the top 10. So this is an alright performance for a comic book movie, especially as Ant-Man doesn't seem to be as popular a character to audiences. Sure, people like Paul Rudd, but Ant-Man is a niche character, and I don't feel like he has the box office draw, the character that is, to engage audiences in this way. But looking at his performance, I think that Marvel just need to go, we need a smaller budget, we don't need to spend this much on a movie, and then $476 million is a more reasonable box office, and they can have more profits if they spend less. Moving on to number 9, we have the animated movie from Disney and Pixar, Elemental. The movie made $496,307,013. Reportedly, the film's budget was around $200 million, and as I said with Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania, the marketing budget was probably equal to that, so presumably this only made a profit of around $96 million, and to be honest, people should be happy with having $96 million, but as we've seen what Bob Iger has said recently about not making unnecessary sequels and focusing on good writing, maybe the fact that they were going for an original story is a good thing. And whilst it hasn't set the global box office on fire as much as Disney would like, generating almost $500 million across the world is quite reasonable, and they should be proud of themselves for making a movie like this. But even with such a small profit in the eyes of Disney, the fact that it probably did very well on streaming services on their Disney Plus platform means it was probably worth the investment. If they could get more people to sign up to the Disney Plus streaming service, then having a film like Elemental, which seemingly is targeted at children, but it needs to be suitable for adults as well, as they're going to be the ones taking their children to see these films, or be the ones watching it with their children at home, or even putting it on for them at home. So it's done a good enough job to generate that much money, and I've not seen the film myself, and I'll probably check it out at some point because I can't scoff at that much money it's made, and I generally do like Pixar movies, and generally I like a lot of the old-fashioned Disney cartoons that they've made over the years. Whilst this film probably could have had a smaller budget and then allowed them to make more profit, it's reasonable, and I do feel like it's done a good enough job, and obviously it's warranted its list in the top 10 of the highest grossing films of 2023. Number 8, we have Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, which generated $567,535,383 at the box office. Despite what you may think, Tom Cruise is certainly a very bankable star, and even with the performance of Top Gun Maverick a couple of years ago, making almost $1.5 billion around the world, there was really no reason to think that Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning, which is a franchise film, wouldn't do great at the box office. Although I've looked this up and it says the budget for the movie was around $291 million, and if you double that for the marketing budget, you can see the film is going to have made a loss. However, this film was in production during COVID-19, and Tom Cruise, you may have heard that rant he did on set about people not social distancing, and him being very stern with the crew about they'll be thrown off the set if they don't obey these rules. And apparently the reason for the ballooning budget of this movie was to put in all these safety precautions against COVID-19. Tom Cruise said in that leaked rant that, he speaks to the studios and the head of Paramount talking about what they need to do and the insurance companies and how this will be the way going forward making films over the next few years. Similar to Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, that production budget blew up simply because of COVID regulations, apparently, and I can't blame them for taking those precautions and allowing them to continue making the movie. It's just a shame that this didn't do better at the box office. I thought the film was actually very good, and Tom Cruise is a bankable star, and I think the studio probably thought that it would do similar numbers to what Top Gun Maverick did. Fortunately, it fell quite short of that. But it does appear they are going to do Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 2, and we'll see how that turns out if it's a bigger box office draw. But even though this film will have made a significant loss, Tom Cruise is still going to be working and he's still a very bankable star. And maybe they'll lower the production budget or try and make cuts on the next movie. But Tom Cruise could probably agree to do more of these films as they're known to generate money, a certain amount of money every year, if Paramount lets him keep on making movies. And he probably has some good faith simply from how well Top Gun Maverick performed. Moving on to number 7 is Disney's The Little Mermaid, the live-action remake of the animated movie of the same name, which only made $569,626,289. Reportedly, though, this film had a budget of around $300 million and reportedly needed to make $625 million in order to break even, so it fell short of that. However, I have heard that this film has done very well on the Disney Plus streaming service. And to be honest, even though if this film lost money, Disney has their fingers in so many pies, it's not a big deal. They'll just have to sell some of their IPs and work harder in the future. It is a bit surprising to me that this film cost as much as it did, but once again, this could be down to the increase in spending money for COVID regulations, so you can't really blame the studio for spending that much money on production to keep it going. Considering other live-action Disney movie remakes have done a lot better financially than this, it was surprising that this didn't perform a bit better, but obviously it's a reasonable amount of money to make, so they shouldn't scoff at this, it's just how it is. And I do know some people have a go at the film just saying it was woke or whatever, but I've not actually seen the film. But I've heard it's alright, I've heard it's quite good from some people, and if it did enough to bring in people to the Disney Plus streaming service, then I'm sure it's merited its existence. Number 6, we have Spider-Man Across the Spiderverse, with a global box office taking of $690,516,673. This film reportedly only had a budget of around $100 million, so this movie is likely to have been very profitable for Sony. Whilst the movie didn't do as well as Sony's Spider-Man No Way Home, which was a joint effort between Sony and Marvel Studios, the fact that it was able to generate almost $700 million at the box office is very impressive. Notably, this made almost double what the first film made in the franchise, Spider-Man Into the Spiderverse. And both films are said to be very good, they're very high quality, and their animation is a very unique way of doing animated movies, and is probably going to shape animation over the next decade and beyond. A sequel called Beyond the Spider-Verse is currently being developed, and they will certainly want to spend a lot of the money reinvesting into the movie, but they don't really need to. They've got a lot of the assets, and I do think they should up the production budget a little bit. And I know there's some controversy around this film because a lot of the animators quit because they were overworked and underpaid. So I don't know if people are going to end up boycotting the next film, but the fact that it's done so well at the box office and has outperformed its predecessor almost by double shows that this film does have legs, and it's done well to get to the 6th place on the top 10 movies of 2023. Moving on to number 5, Fast X, or Fast 10, the 10th installment in the Fast and Furious franchise, which generated $704,875,015 at the box office. This film reportedly cost around $340 million to make. The original director, Justin Lin, left the project after just a few days after falling out with Vin Diesel, allegedly, and French director Louis Leterrier. The Fast and Furious franchise is usually having massive budgets, and to their credit, they have a lot of practical effects, but the fact that this film was probably also made with COVID restrictions in line, that's probably why the budget inflated to so much, which is quite shocking for a movie. I don't know if this is actually verified at $340 million to make the movie, and as I said, double that for the marketing budget. This film is barely profitable at all, which is a real shame. Some of the other Fast and Furious movies have managed to break the $1 billion box office target, But like with what's going on with Marvel Studios and comic book movies, these big franchise films are just getting a little old for audiences, and maybe they're not engaging with them as the studios had have hoped. This isn't going to stop Universal going down the road of making more movies by any chance, and they are already doing the spin-off with The Rock and the character Jason Momoa played, Dante Reyes. I'm also not too sure if this movie is able to generate more income through merchandising. I'm sure it probably does, so it could have ended up actually being very profitable for the studio. And they still probably have a lot of faith in the franchise, as it has made them a lot of money over the last 20 years in which the series has been running. Next up, at number 4, we have Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, which made $845,555,777. Reportedly having a budget of around $250 million, so double that with the marketing budget, it needed to make $500 million to break even, so we've got a nice little profit of around $350 million. However, considering this is a Disney-owned movie, they would have had to use that money to bail out the other losses of the films they've released this year, which is unfortunate. And this film kind of proves that there is a real need for good movies and good storytelling. James Gunn seems to be a very competent writer, and he's a fan of the comic book franchise movies, and he does seem to put the care and quality that the films need to be successful. Whereas you look at the other performances of the Marvel movies over the last few years, they have been declining and people are just seemingly bored of it. And even looking at the DC movies that have come out, which are barely making 200 million worldwide, you really need to have someone who understands the story, these characters, and the ultimate goal in a movie is to tell a good story and have a director who's passionate about telling the story and bringing it to life. A lot of the Marvel movies are seemingly just made to give the audience what they want, but fans are no longer interested in that. They want good movies, they want good quality movies, and they want good story. And James Gunn was brought back to direct this film after being fired due to some tweets he made, and he would come back to do this movie and then move on to running DC Studios over at Warner Brothers. Whilst this didn't make as much as Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, I do feel like even with the comic book movie fatigue, this did very, very well. And the fact that it was the 4th highest grossing movie of 2023 gives it a lot of credit to its quality. And if you haven't seen the movie, I do suggest you watch it. And if you are a fan of the Marvel films in general, this will likely be towards the top end of all the movies they've released. I think James Gunn does write good characters and interesting characters, and with some of the other writers they've got on other projects, they don't seem that interested in comic book movies. Even Kevin Feige has mentioned that they don't like to have fans write these movies, and maybe that's their big mistake in recent years. They need to have someone who's really passionate about comic book movies, take on these stories, and give the audience something they need. This movie was a great final arc in the trilogy, and it gave some closure to the characters that we've fallen in love with over the Guardians of the Galaxy trilogy and the other films that they featured in, and also Chukwudi Iwuji's performance as the High Evolutionary is fantastic and really stands out as one of the greatest Marvel villains of all time, in my opinion. Seeing this movie does give me hope for what James Gunn is doing over at DC with Superman Legacy, although I'm still a little bit pessimistic about that, just how DC has been performing over the last few years. And even with James Gunn's shared universe, I'm not sure that's the correct direction they need to go in. But I do have faith that he will create a competent story, and whether or not audiences can get behind that is a different matter entirely, but we'll have to wait and see in 2025. Number 3 is Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer, which made $952,023,130. This film reportedly only had a budget of around $100 million, and then obviously $100 million for marketing, so the movie has made a massive profit. And the fact that the film is a biopic that's 3 hours long and deals with a heavy subject matter, it's an absolute miracle that the movie made as much money as it did. It is an absolute miracle that this film made as much money as it did, and it has given hopes to people that we want to see great movies made, and we will go and see long movies, and we can get behind directors who create good movies. So we don't need to have these big franchises to get interested in going to the cinema again. It's great that this film was able to do so well, and the fact that it had a smaller budget than what Christopher Nolan is used to shows his skill as a director, and just shows that, filmmaking, just because you spend more money on it, doesn't guarantee it's going to do well or even be better quality. I reckon Christopher Nolan could have got more money to make this movie than what he asked for from Universal. After his departure from Warner Brothers, all the other studios were fighting over him to make his next movie. But the fact that he's sensible enough to go, this is a biopic, it's not a comic book movie, it's not going to require all these massive set pieces that will cost lots of money, it is people talking in a room, and that's where the drama comes from. Obviously we get to see the recreation of the Trinity test, which is very impressive, but I still think he could have got a $150 million budget for this movie, and Universal probably would have paid it. $200 million would probably be pushing it, but the limitations of a budget can make a film better and encourage the creative process in a filmmaker in making something unique. People get lazy if you just throw money at it. When you look at all these comic book movies that their CGI is terrible, it's just because they spend a lot of money on it, but they have all these reworks and they do it to deadlines and they don't really care about the quality of it. They just put all this pressure on visual effects studios and they expect it to be done, and they don't care that it looks bad at the end of the day. These visual effects studios need time to do this work and they're not given it. Oppenheimer actually went into post-production for a year, and that never happens on these big-budget Marvel movies. They have a much faster turnaround, and it's said that these visual effects artists are working up until the deadline when it's about to come out in cinemas. And hopefully this also creates a message that you need to give these artists, and they are artists, enough time to do their work. And people aren't just going to put up with these poor visual effects anymore. And I hope the message from Oppenheimer that we can have these big budget movies, but we spend money on it, we take care, and we care about the outcome of every frame of the movie. And this pays off financially. Look how well the film has done. Number 2 is the Super Mario Bros. Movie, with a box office of $1,361,367,353. Reportedly having a budget of $125 million, this film has been able to enter the $1 billion club, and I was slightly surprised that this film did as well as it did. Obviously it was being created by Illumination and collaboration with Nintendo, who own the intellectual property, but I did wonder if this film would just appeal directly to the Nintendo audience, the people who are big fans of the video games, and maybe this wouldn't appeal to the young child audience, although that seems to have been the case that it did do that. I do feel like these sort of films will attract the children to go and see these movies, but obviously this is propped up by a famous video game IP, and video games in general kind of generate more money than movies at the moment, so it's no surprise that this IP is able to generate that much money at the global box office, but I was just still surprised that it did as well as it did. And now there are even talks of Illumination working alongside Nintendo to bring out more animated movies and work on a Super Smash Bros. Cinematic universe, as it were. The Super Mario Bros. Movie that came out in the 90s was panned by critics and people hate that film. But this film was clearly a success because Nintendo worked closely with Illumination to make the film worthwhile. And if they can craft those movies coming down the line, that with the Nintendo IP brand in the future, I'm sure they're going to be very lucrative in the years to come. And these animated movies obviously appeal to the general audience as well as children, and the child audience is a very lucrative market overall. Finally, at number 1, we have Barbie, which generated $1,441,820,453 globally. And the film's budget reportedly was $140 million. The The movie has obviously made the most at the global box office than any other film this year, and it's going to hold that title indefinitely because no other movie is going to sneak up and steal it from Barbie at this time. Although the fact that the film did so well appeals to the fact that it is an intellectual property that people are aware of, but for films to generate over $1 billion at the box office, you need to take the general audience along with you. This movie did appeal to the broader cinematic audience. It lent into like the cinematic trope with Stanley Kubrick opening with similar shots to 2001: A Space Odyssey. It was obviously the brand of Mattel Barbie dolls that would draw audiences in. I assume a lot of children went to see this movie, although I don't necessarily think this was mainly targeted at children. And they had someone like Greta Gerwig, who is an auteur in filmmaking and is really making a name for herself in Hollywood. And the fact that she's been able to make a movie that's generated this much money means she's going to do very well over the next few years, I imagine. Although I do worry that this film's success is they're going to take the wrong lessons from it. Rather than just picking up that Greta Gerwig is a great filmmaker and what she did brought audiences in, and there's probably stuff down to how the film was marketed that led to its financial success. But Mattel, after seeing the success of this, are like throwing all their IPs into movies now. And just because that's like the wrong lesson, you need to have a director and a writer who's passionate about a project and wants to tell a certain story and something that relates to audiences. They could catch lightning in a bottle multiple times with these Mattel movies coming down the line, but I'm not sure they're going to quite crack it. I feel they are going to learn the wrong lessons from this. And people have said you need to give someone like Greta Gerwig, these auteurs, and even in general female filmmakers, the voice and the authority to make a movie with a big budget and deal with a big IP, and hopefully it pays off for the studios. So I really feel that these future Mattel movies might not live up to what Barbie has done. And the fact that Greta Gerwig has said she's not necessarily interested in making a sequel to Barbie says a lot about her priorities as a filmmaker. I'm pretty sure Mattel and the studio Warner Brothers would happily throw hundreds of millions at her to bother making a sequel, but if her heart's just not in it, it's not going to be worthwhile, it's not going to be as good, and there's no point in a filmmaker doing it just for the money. Not to say that another female director or any other director could take over this IP and deliver something new and unique with it, but the fact that they just feel, oh, we've got this IP and we're going to milk it, is the wrong lesson of Barbie's success. So I do really hope the wrong lesson isn't taken from the success of Barbie. But to be honest, Hollywood executives seem to be the most out-of-touch people in the entire planet, so I'm not hopeful, but fingers crossed. So that's it for this video. I hope you've enjoyed me talking about the top 10 box office movies of 2023, and I would like to hear your thoughts on the favourite films of 2023, whether you went to see these at the cinema, have only managed to catch them on television or on a streaming service at a later date. Please give this video a like, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and please click the bell icon to receive notifications for all of my videos. That's it for now. Thanks for tuning in.